the Mafia boss who discovered his secret son. Gabriel Reyes commanded Chicago's underworld with an iron fist. At 37, he controlled a criminal empire worth hundreds of millions, untouchable deals, ghost transactions, a name that made even East Coast syndicates hesitate. But for 3 years, the man who had everything felt absolutely nothing. His wife, Catherine, Kate to those who loved her, died in a car bombing meant for him. Since that day, Gabriel existed inside a 3,000-square-meter fortress in Chicago's wealthiest suburbs. He signed contracts, moved money, gave orders. A machine running on autopilot. No spark, no purpose, just the mechanical rhythm of survival. Until he noticed something odd about his housekeeper. Scarlett Moore was 27, invisible by design. She'd worked in the mansion for 5 years, hired personally by Kate before everything fell apart. Now she represented the last living connection to his dead wife. For half a decade, she moved through the estate like a ghost, efficient, silent, forgettable. But lately, Gabriel's attention kept drifting toward her. She was pregnant, unmistakably so. Her uniform stretched tight across her growing belly, her movements careful and deliberate. Yet in 5 years, she'd never mentioned a husband, never spoke of a boyfriend, never brought up any man at all. Gabriel started watching closer. The way she pressed her hand to her stomach during waves of nausea, how she avoided lifting anything heavy, the tremor in her fingers whenever he passed nearby. Her eyes never met his anymore. She seemed constantly on the verge of speaking, then swallowing her words. What was she hiding? Who fathered that child? And why did she keep working instead of requesting leave like any normal person would? One Friday afternoon, when Scarlett left through the service entrance with her worn black bag, Gabriel did something he hadn't done in 3 years. He followed her. Not in his armored Bentley, not with his usual security convoy. He took an unmarked sedan, kept his distance, and tailed the city bus she rode every evening. He couldn't explain the compulsion. Maybe weeks of curiosity had finally broken through his apathy. Maybe loneliness had cracked something open inside him. Maybe some instinct he didn't understand was pulling him forward. The bus carried her to a neighborhood Gabriel had never set foot in, a working-class wasteland on Chicago's fringe. Crumbling apartment blocks, reeking stairwells, the distant wail of children crying through paper-thin walls. What he discovered, there didn't just make the coldest crime lord in Chicago break down in tears. It changed his life forever. Gabriel waited in the car, letting enough time pass to avoid suspicion. Then he pushed through the building's rusted entrance. The stench hit immediately: mildew, decay, desperation. Water stains spread across peeling walls. A single flickering bulb struggled overhead, threatening to die completely. This was a universe away from his world. He'd grown up in Mafia royalty, lived in mansions since childhood, expanded an empire as an adult. His reality was champagne negotiations in penthouse suites, private jets to Europe, power at his fingertips. And this place, where his housekeeper returned every single day, was hell. He climbed. Each stair groaned beneath his weight, protesting his intrusion. First floor. Second. Third. Gabriel kept his breathing steady, footsteps light. He didn't know what he was searching for, only that something drove him upward. Fourth floor. The hallway stretched narrow and dark, a single dying bulb at the far end. 3 doors. Gabriel had watched which one Scarlett entered, the last apartment, faded blue paint on splintered wood. He approached slowly, every sense heightened. Then he heard it. "Mom, you're home." A child's voice, clear, excited, innocent. Gabriel froze. His heart stuttered, then hammered against his ribs. "Mom." Scarlett had a child. Her voice came next, warm in a way he'd never heard in 5 years. "Yes, sweetheart, I'm home. Were you good today? Did you eat?" A child's laughter rang out, bright as bells. Gabriel pressed his back against the icy wall, unable to move. Scarlett had a child she'd never mentioned. 5 years of working in his mansion, and she'd kept an entire human being secret. Every morning she arrived, worked in silence, disappeared at night. And he, her employer, had never asked, never cared, never seen her as anything beyond a servant. Standing in that dark hallway, Gabriel realized he knew nothing about the woman who'd been beside him for half a decade. She had a child, she was pregnant with another, and she'd hidden everything. Why? The question drilled into his skull. Why hide it? Why never mention it? And most critically, how old was the child behind that door? Gabriel tried calculating. 5 years of employment. If something had happened just before her long absence 5 years ago, the timeline made perfect sense. The boy could be 4. 5 years ago, when Kate was still alive, when doctors told them Kate couldn't have children, when Gabriel got so drunk one night he remembered nothing the next morning. A horrifying thought began forming in Gabriel's mind. Dark, impossible, growing like cancer despite his resistance. Then the apartment door flew open. Scarlett stood there, hand frozen on the doorknob. She'd been stepping out, trash, errands, something mundane. But every intention evaporated when her eyes locked onto Gabriel's. Her face transformed from surprise to pure horror. Blood drained from her features, leaving skin that was already pale from exhaustion ghost white. Her lips moved soundlessly. Her eyes were enormous, full of fear, confusion, and something that looked painfully like guilt. Mr. Rays, the words trembled out of her. But Gabriel wasn't looking at her anymore. His gaze had locked onto the little boy clinging to his mother's leg, peeking out with innocent curiosity. Around 4 years old, blue superhero pajamas, messy black hair like he'd just woken up. When the child lifted his face, Gabriel's world collapsed. Ink-black eyes, not brown, not hazel, pure, endless black, the exact shade Gabriel saw in the mirror every single day. The boy's features were still soft, cheeks round with baby fat, but sharper lines were emerging underneath. A slightly square jaw, a straight nose, and the way the boy tilted his head while studying something with curiosity, identical to Gabriel's unconscious habit. Kate used to tease him about it, said he looked like a confused puppy trying to understand human speech. Now the child in front of him was doing it exactly the same way. "Mom, who is this man?" The boy's voice was clear, innocent, unaware his simple question had just torn open the heart of the man standing there. Gabriel couldn't answer. His throat had closed completely. He only stood there, staring at the child, memorizing every detail of that small face, searching for some flaw, some proof he was mistaken. But the longer he looked, the more he saw himself. In those black eyes, in that square chin, in the way the boy held his back straight, confident even facing a stranger. Time stopped. The moldy hallway, the murmuring television next door, everything vanished. Only Gabriel, Scarlett, and the child remained, 3 people in a narrow doorway, holding a secret buried for 4 years. "Ethan, go inside, sweetheart." Scarlett's voice was rough, almost pleading. She gently pushed the boy back, but Ethan still turned to look at Gabriel with open curiosity. "Ethan." Gabriel carved the name into his mind like etching stone. When the child finally disappeared, Scarlett and Gabriel faced each other in silence. She didn't run. There was nowhere left to run. Tears began sliding down her cheeks, soundless. She simply stood there, both hands wrapped protectively around her pregnant belly, waiting for the storm she knew was coming. "That boy," Gabriel finally spoke, his voice low and raw, each word dragged from his throat by force. "How old is he?" Scarlett closed her eyes. Tears kept falling. When she opened them again, they held 4 years of suffering, 4 years of secrecy, 4 years of carrying everything alone. 4, she whispered. Ethan is 4 years old. The answer, even though Gabriel had already known, still struck like a hammer. 4 years old. 5 years ago. The night he'd been drunk beyond memory. Everything snapped into place like puzzle pieces he'd never wanted to see. Scarlett drew a long, shaking breath, trying to steady herself even as her entire body trembled. She stepped back, opened the door wider, and spoke softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please come in." Gabriel crossed the threshold like a sleepwalker. He was no longer the powerful crime lord, no longer the man who controlled an empire. In that moment, he was simply a man who just discovered a truth that could change everything. The apartment was tiny, less than 40 square meters, smaller than his master bathroom. Living room, kitchen, 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom. But what caught Gabriel's attention wasn't the size. It was the cleanliness. Everything was old. A worn fabric sofa, a scratched wooden table, a refrigerator humming like it might die any second. Yet everything had been carefully maintained, wiped down, neatly arranged. Not a speck of dust anywhere. This was the home of a woman who cleaned for a living. All over the walls were children's drawings, crayon scribbles, houses, trees, a smiling sun, a woman with long hair holding a small boy's hand. Gabriel stared at those pictures, his heart tightening. This was his son's life. For 4 years, while he lived in a 3,000 square meter mansion with dozens of servants, his son had been growing up here. While he signed million-dollar contracts, his son drew pictures with cheap crayons and taped them to stained walls. "Ethan, go into your room and play with your toys." Scarlett's voice was gentle but trembling. "Mom needs to talk to our guest." Ethan looked at his mother, then at Gabriel, curiosity still bright in his eyes. But he nodded obediently and ran into the small room, where Gabriel glimpsed cheap plastic toys scattered across the floor. The door closed. Silence descended. Scarlett stood beside the table, both hands still wrapped around her pregnant belly like a shield. She didn't dare sit, didn't dare meet Gabriel's eyes. She simply stood there, waiting like a defendant awaiting verdict. Gabriel didn't sit either. He stood in the middle of the cramped room, tall and out of place among the worn furniture. The air felt heavy enough to cut. They both knew what was about to be said would change everything. Finally, Gabriel broke the silence. "Tell me," his voice was low, almost inaudible. "Tell me everything." Scarlett closed her eyes, gathering every last shred of courage inside her. When she opened them again, they were red-rimmed, and her voice dropped lower, carrying the weight of 4 years spent holding a secret alone. She began to speak, word by word, peeling away layers of ice that had hardened around her heart. 5 years ago, Kate went to California to care for her seriously ill grandmother. It was the first time since their marriage that Kate had been away from Gabriel for more than a few days. Scarlett remembered that evening clearly, the day everything changed. Gabriel returned to the mansion with a face white as death. He didn't speak to anyone, just went straight into his study and slammed the door. Scarlett was only 22 then, just a few months into the job. She didn't dare ask questions. That night around 11 p.m., while finishing her final chores, she heard sounds from the living room. A liquor bottle clinking against glass. A heavy, exhausted sigh. Then crying. Scarlett froze. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Gabriel Reyes, the crime lord all of Chicago feared, was crying. Not loud sobs, but choked, painful sounds. A man trying to hold it in and no longer able to. She should have walked away, should have pretended she hadn't heard anything. But Kate had told her, "If anything happens to Gabriel while I'm away, take care of him for me." Kate said Gabriel looked strong outside, but inside he was more fragile than anyone knew. So Scarlett pushed the door open. Gabriel was sitting on the floor, back against the sofa, surrounded by an empty whiskey bottle and scattered papers. He lifted his head, eyes bloodshot and unfocused, full of pain. And he told her what happened. That afternoon, he'd received test results from the doctor. Kate couldn't have children. The doctors had run every test, every examination. Their conclusion was final. Kate's body could not carry a pregnancy. Their biggest dream, the dream of having a child, had shattered completely. Gabriel told Scarlett how desperately Kate wanted to be a mother, about the nights she'd whispered about the nursery they would decorate, about the names they'd already chosen. And now, none of it would ever become real. He didn't know how to tell Kate, didn't know how to face her pain. He, a man who could solve any problem with money and power, was completely helpless. Scarlett sat down beside him. She didn't know what to say. What words could soften pain like that? She just sat there, silent, so he would know he wasn't alone. Gabriel kept drinking, crying, talking. About Kate. About their love. About his fear of losing her. About feeling like a failure because he couldn't give her the one thing she wanted most. He got so drunk, he couldn't control his words anymore. Couldn't control his actions. And then, at some point in the night, when Scarlett tried helping him stand to take him to his room, everything went beyond control. Scarlett stopped there, her voice catching. She didn't blame Gabriel, didn't blame herself. She only said it was a night when neither of them was truly themselves. He was drowning in grief and alcohol. She only wanted to comfort him, to ease his pain the way Kate had asked. But the boundary was crossed. When Scarlett woke the next morning, Gabriel was still sleeping heavily. She left the room in silence, heart pounding, mind in chaos. She didn't know what to do, only knew that what happened could destroy everything. When Gabriel woke around noon, he remembered nothing. He looked at Scarlett the way he always did, ordered breakfast with no memory of the night before. That night had been wiped clean from his mind by too much alcohol. And Scarlett decided she would keep that secret forever. Gabriel stood in silence, listening to every word. He didn't interrupt, didn't react, only stood there like stone while the story slowly unfolded. Scarlett continued, her voice steadier now, as if finally speaking these secrets aloud was loosening the weight crushing her shoulders. She explained why she chose silence, not because she feared losing her job, not because she feared what Gabriel might do, but because of Kate. Scarlett spoke of Kate with tear-bright eyes, with love Gabriel could feel was real. Kate was the first person in Scarlett's life who treated her like a human being. Before the mansion, Scarlett had worked many places. Everywhere, she was just the help. Invisible, nameless. But Kate was different. Kate asked about her life, her past, her dreams. Kate invited her to sit and eat when there were no guests. Kate bought her a warm coat that first winter, saying she didn't want Scarlett cold when she went to the market in early mornings. Kate was the older sister Scarlett never had, the family she'd never experienced, the only light in the dark life of a girl who'd been orphaned at 16. After that fateful night, Scarlett lived in hell. She watched Kate return from California, watched Kate smile as she wrapped her arms around her husband, watched the tenderness Kate gave Gabriel. Scarlett wanted to die. She had betrayed the kindest woman she'd ever met, done something unforgivable to the woman who treated her like a sister. But she couldn't speak it aloud. If she did, Kate and Gabriel's marriage would collapse. Kate would suffer, and Scarlett couldn't bear being the one who caused Kate pain. So she chose silence, told herself it was one terrible mistake. Gabriel remembered nothing. Kate knew nothing. Everything would pass as if it never happened. But fate wouldn't let her forget. 1 month later, Scarlett began feeling sick every morning. She bought a pregnancy test at a pharmacy far from the mansion. When 2 red lines appeared, her world fell apart. She cried all night in her small staff room. Silent crying, pillow pressed over her mouth so no one would hear. She was carrying Gabriel's child, Kate's husband's child, the child Kate longed for but could never have. Scarlett stood before two choices, and both were hell. If she told the truth, she'd destroy Kate. A woman who just learned she couldn't have children would face the reality that her housekeeper was pregnant with her husband's child. That pain could kill Kate. If she kept the secret, she'd have to carry everything alone. Alone through pregnancy. Alone through birth. Alone raising a child whose father didn't know he existed. Scarlett chose the second path, chose to sacrifice herself to protect Kate. She asked for 6 months off, claiming she had to care for a gravely ill relative. Kate never suspected. Gabriel didn't even care enough to ask. Scarlett vanished from the mansion, with a child in her womb and agony in her heart. Those 6 months were the darkest stretch of her life. She rented a cheap room on the city's outskirts, living off meager savings. Prenatal checkups at a public clinic where no one asked about the father. She ate whatever she could afford, saving every dollar for the day she'd give birth. When Ethan was born in a public hospital on a rainy November night, Scarlett was alone in the delivery room. No one held her hand. No one wiped the sweat from her face. No one gathered her into their arms when she cried from pain and exhaustion. Only her, and the newborn baby with ink-black eyes exactly like his father's. Scarlett looked at her son for the first time and cried. She cried with happiness, cried with pain, cried because she knew her life would never be easy again. But she also knew she'd do anything to protect this child, even if she had to sacrifice everything. After Ethan was born, money disappeared day by day. Rent, formula, diapers, doctor visits for a newborn who cried through the nights. Every cent had to be calculated with care. She tried finding other work, but who would hire a single mother with no degree, no experience beyond cleaning, and a newborn to care for? She was rejected dozens of times. When Ethan was 4 months old, she had money for only 2 more weeks. That's when she decided to go back to the mansion. She knew it was insane, working for the father of her child while he had no idea the child existed, seeing him every day while hiding the biggest secret of her life. But she had no choice. The mansion paid well. She needed money to raise her son. Kate welcomed her back with open arms. That kind woman never suspected a thing, only happy her little sister had returned. Scarlett had to live with that torment every day, watching Kate smile at her while knowing she was hiding a secret that could destroy Kate's life. Scarlett found Rosa, a widowed neighbor who agreed to watch Ethan for a small fee. Every morning, Scarlett woke at 4 a.m., fed Ethan, bathed him, left him with Rosa, then caught the bus to the mansion. Every night she came home when Ethan was already asleep, only able to press a kiss to his forehead before collapsing from exhaustion. Those years passed like a never-ending nightmare. She worked 12-hour days cleaning the enormous mansion, serving the man she knew was her child's father but could never say aloud. She watched Gabriel walk past her without a glance and told herself that was for the best. If he didn't care about her, he'd never discover the secret. Then Kate died. Scarlett stopped there, her voice tightening. She said the day Kate died was the day she lost the only family she had. She cried countless nights, not only because she lost Kate, but because she felt relief knowing Kate would never learn the truth. And then she hated herself for that relief. 3 years after Kate died, Scarlett met Derek. He was the plumber called when her apartment started leaking. Gentle smile, warm voice, a way of looking at her as if she were the most beautiful woman in the world. For the first time in years, Scarlett felt loved. Derek made promises, said he'd marry her, care for Ethan as his own, give her a real family. And Scarlett, a woman who'd been alone too long, believed him. She gave him everything left of her heart, then discovered she was pregnant. When she told Derek, He went quiet for a long time, said he needed time to think. The next day, he vanished, number disconnected, apartment returned to the landlord, not a single goodbye, no explanation. He evaporated from her life, as if he'd never existed. Scarlett found herself at the edge once again, alone with a 4-year-old child and a baby growing inside her. No husband, no family, no one to lean on. She thought about ending the pregnancy, but when she looked at Ethan, looked into the clear black eyes of her son, she couldn't. Even if the baby in her womb was the result of betrayal, it was still her blood. She'd love that child the way she loved Ethan. Scarlett lifted her head and looked at Gabriel. Her eyes were red but no longer spilling tears. She'd cried too much in her life. Even her tears had run dry. Now there was only exhaustion, an acceptance that the secret she'd kept buried for 4 years had finally been exposed. When Scarlett finished, the apartment sank into heavy silence. Not a sound, not a breath, only the distant murmur of traffic and the soft clatter of toys from the room where Ethan played alone. Gabriel stood motionless. He'd heard everything, every detail, every wound, every sacrifice this woman had quietly carried for 4 years. And now all the feelings he'd frozen inside himself for 3 years slammed into him at once like a tidal wave. His legs lost strength. He stumbled back, pressed his spine against the stained wall, then slowly slid down until he was sitting on the floor. The broad shoulders of the most powerful crime lord in Chicago began to tremble. Then the tears came. Gabriel Reyes, the man the entire East Coast underworld feared, was crying. Not loud, broken sobs. Silent tears that rolled down his sharp face and fell onto the dirty floor. He cried from guilt, because he'd done something unforgivable that drunken night, even if he remembered nothing. Because he'd left Scarlett to bear the consequences alone for 4 years. He cried from loss, because 4 years had passed and he never knew he had a child. 4 years in which that child grew up without a father. 4 years in which he'd missed every important moment in a child's life. And he cried for Kate, because his beloved wife died without ever knowing her dream of being a mother had, in some way, come true. Even if the child wasn't hers, the child was Gabriel's, the blood of the man she loved more than anyone. Right then, the door to the small room opened. Ethan ran out, maybe tired of playing alone. The boy stopped when he saw Gabriel sitting on the floor, eyes red, tears streaming down his face. Ethan tilted his head, studying Gabriel with big, round black eyes full of questions. Then he ran over, sat down in front of him, and in the clear voice of a 4-year-old asked, "Mister, why are you crying? Does it hurt?" Gabriel looked at the child in front of him, and his heart felt like someone had squeezed it shut. This was his son, his own blood. A child carrying half his genes, with black eyes identical to his, with the same head tilt when curious. And Gabriel had missed everything. Missed Ethan's first cry at birth. Missed sleepless nights when his son was sick with fever. Missed the first words, maybe mama or dada. But Gabriel hadn't been there to hear them. Missed the first unsteady steps on tiny feet. Missed the first smile when baby teeth started coming in. Missed the first, second, third, fourth birthdays. 4 years, 1,460 days. Countless precious moments he'd never get back. While he lived in a luxury mansion drowning in grief for Kate, his son grew up in this cramped apartment. While he signed million-dollar contracts, his son played with cheap plastic toys. While he pitied himself for having no reason to live, that reason was right here, only a few miles away, and he'd never known. Ethan lifted his tiny hand, awkwardly wiping the tears from Gabriel's cheek. "Don't cry, mister. Mom says crying too much isn't good. Do you want to play cars with me? Playing cars is fun. You'll stop being sad." Gabriel looked into his son's clear eyes, looked at the small hand wiping his tears, and something began to shift inside him. For the first time in 3 years since Kate died, he felt something other than emptiness. Not pain, not guilt. Hope. Hope that his life could still have meaning, that he could still have a reason to live, that maybe, just maybe, this was the chance fate was offering him. A chance to start over, a chance to become the father Ethan deserved. Gabriel left Scarlett's apartment when night had fully settled. He didn't say much before leaving, only looked at Ethan one more time, gave Scarlett a small nod like a silent promise he'd return, then started down the stairs with legs that felt weighted with stone. When he reached the street, he slid into the black sedan still parked along the curb, started the engine, meaning to drive back to the mansion. But the moment his hand touched the steering wheel, he realized he couldn't. He couldn't return to that enormous empty house, couldn't face the terrifying silence of rooms that once held Kate's laughter. Not tonight, not with his mind a storm he couldn't control. Gabriel shut the engine off and sank back into the seat. He stared up at the fourth-floor window of the crumbling building, where a weak yellow light still spilled through an old curtain. Scarlett probably couldn't sleep tonight either, likely sitting in that tiny apartment, frightened of what tomorrow would bring. Frightened of what Gabriel might do with the secret she'd kept buried for 4 years. The Chicago night was freezing, but Gabriel didn't turn on the heat. He let the cold seep into his skin, as if physical pain could dull the pain inside his chest. His thoughts spun with 1,000 tangled lines. Shock came first. Even though he'd suspected it the moment he saw Ethan, when Scarlett confirmed the truth, it still hit like a fist to his heart. He had a child, a 4-year-old son whose existence he'd never known. Guilt came second. He'd made a mistake that drunken night. Even if he didn't remember, even if he never intended it, he was still responsible. He'd left Scarlett to carry the consequences alone. She'd been pregnant alone, given birth alone, raised their child alone for 4 years. While he lived wrapped in luxury, she fought over every penny just to buy milk for her son. Pain came third, the deepest and most stubborn. Pain for the 4 years that were gone. Pain for moments he could never reclaim. Pain because Ethan had grown up without knowing his father's face, without knowing his father was only a few miles away. And then, in the bitter late-night cold, Gabriel thought of Kate. If Kate were still alive, how would she have reacted? The question drilled into his mind. Kate would have been devastated, that much was certain. Learning her husband had a child with the housekeeper, no matter the circumstances, would have been a knife driven straight into her heart. But Gabriel knew his wife. He knew Kate's heart. She was the most compassionate woman he'd ever met. She loved children more than anything. She'd cried when she learned she couldn't have a baby, not because of herself, but because she wanted to love a child, to watch one grow, to be a mother. Gabriel believed that no matter how painful the circumstances, Kate would have found a way to love Ethan. Not immediately, not easily, but in the end, her heart wouldn't have been able to resist an innocent child, especially a child who carried the blood of the man she loved. Maybe Kate would have been angry with him. Maybe she'd have needed time to accept it. But Gabriel knew one thing with absolute certainty. Kate would never have allowed Ethan to suffer for the mistakes of adults. She would have pulled the child into her arms the way she once held orphans at the charity clinic where they first met. Thinking of that, Gabriel broke down again. This time it wasn't guilt or pain that undid him. It was longing for Kate, longing for her gentleness, longing for her forgiving heart, longing for the way she always seemed to know what the right thing was. And he wondered, what would Kate want him to do now? The answer rose in his mind with sharp clarity, as if Kate were whispering it into his ear. She would want him to take care of Ethan. She would want him to be the father that child deserved. She would want him to live, not merely exist, but truly live for the child they never imagined he could have. Gabriel sat in the car all night, staring up at the fourth-floor window until the light went out, then kept staring into the darkness. He didn't sleep, only thought about the past, the present, and the future. The Chicago sky slowly shifted from black to gray, then from gray to pale pink, as the first rays of a new day began rising along the horizon. Gabriel was still sitting in the car, eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep, yet his mind was sharper than it had been in years. All through the long night, he'd thought about Ethan, about Scarlett, about Kate, about his life and the choices that brought him to this moment. And as the sun slowly climbed, spilling warm golden light over the crumbling apartment blocks, Gabriel finally had his answer. He wouldn't run. That was the first thing he was certain of. For 3 years, he'd run from the pain of losing Kate by burying himself in work, in emptiness, in the cold shell he wore every day. But this time would be different. This time, he'd face it. He wouldn't be angry. That was the second thing. Scarlett had kept the secret for 4 years, but she hadn't done it out of selfishness or to harm him. She'd done it because of Kate, because of the love she carried for the woman who treated her like a sister, because she didn't want to destroy someone else's happiness, even if it meant trading away her own life. Gabriel had no right to be angry at a woman who'd sacrificed so much. And he would do the right thing. For the first time in his 37 years, Gabriel Reyes would make a decision not for the criminal empire, not for money, not for power or status, but for family. Real family. He'd spent his whole life building an underground empire, becoming a name the underworld feared, proving himself in a world where weakness meant death. But what did any of it matter if he had no one to share it with? What did it matter when he returned to that enormous mansion every night and only silence greeted him? Kate had once been the meaning of his life. When she died, he thought that meaning died with her. But now fate had given him a second chance. Ethan, his son, his own blood, a 4-year-old child with clear black eyes and a smile that could melt even the frozen heart of a crime lord. Gabriel drew a deep breath, feeling the early morning air fill his lungs. He looked up at the fourth-floor window one more time. Morning sun was shining through the old curtain, making it glow like a promise of brighter days ahead. He would go back to that apartment. He'd tell Scarlett he wasn't angry, that he understood, that he wanted to be Ethan's father, not with money or power, but with presence, with love, with everything he could give. For the first time in 3 years, Gabriel smiled. At exactly 9 a.m., Gabriel stood in front of the faded blue wooden door. From sunrise until now, he'd spent the time buying coffee and bread at a small shop nearby, not because he was hungry, but because he needed something to do while waiting for a proper hour to knock. He didn't want to come too early and wake Ethan. He wanted to speak with Scarlett first, wanted her to understand what he'd decided during the long night. Gabriel drew a deep breath, then lifted his hand and knocked. 3 gentle taps, nothing like the way he used to knock at the mansion, all authority and command. This time he knocked like a man asking permission to enter, like a man begging for a chance. A few seconds passed, then light footsteps, the lock turning, the door slowly opening. Scarlett stood there, still wearing yesterday's clothes, hair a mess, eyes swollen and red. Clearly she hadn't slept either. Clearly she'd cried, maybe all night, anxious and terrified about what would happen next. When she saw Gabriel, her eyes widened with shock and panic. She must have imagined hundreds of outcomes. That he'd send lawyers to take custody. That he'd fire her. That he'd be furious and take revenge the way a crime lord could. But she hadn't expected him to come back himself. The very next morning, a bag of bread in his hand and sleep-starved eyes rimmed with red. "Mr. Reyes," Scarlett's voice was rough and trembling. I can explain." Gabriel lifted a hand, stopping her. "You don't need to explain anything else," he said, his voice low and gentle. "I've heard everything, And I've been thinking all night. Scarlett stood there, hands unconsciously wrapped around her pregnant belly in a reflex of self-protection. She waited, waiting for the storm, waiting for accusations, threats, everything she'd imagined for 4 years whenever she thought about this secret being exposed. But instead, Gabriel said something she never could have expected. "I'm not angry with you." Scarlett blinked, as if she couldn't believe her own ears. "I'm not angry," Gabriel repeated, his voice steady and clear. "I understand why you kept it secret. You did it for Kate, because you loved her and didn't want to hurt her. That isn't a sin, that's sacrifice." Began sliding down Scarlett's cheeks, but she didn't move, still unable to believe what she was hearing. Gabriel continued, every word measured with care. "I missed 4 years of Ethan's life. 4 years I can never get back, but I don't want to miss one more day." He looked straight into Scarlett's eyes, the gaze of a man who'd found his purpose again. "I want to know my son. I want to be Ethan's father. I want to make up for everything I wasn't there for, not with money or power, but with my presence, with love, with being beside him every day." Scarlett broke apart. The tears she'd been trying to hold back poured out like a flood, uncontrollable. Her shoulders shook, and she had to grip the doorframe to keep from collapsing. These weren't tears of pain or fear. These were tears of release. For 4 years, she'd lived in the shadow of a secret. For 4 years, she'd lived braced for the day everything would fall apart. She'd imagined hundreds of terrible endings. But she'd never dared imagine this one. The ending where Gabriel would forgive her. The ending where he'd want to be a father. The ending where maybe, just maybe, Ethan could finally have a complete family. "Why?" Scarlett whispered through her tears. "Why aren't you angry? I hid your son from you for 4 years." Gabriel shook his head, cutting her off. "You raised my son alone for 4 years while I didn't even know. You sacrificed your youth, sacrificed your life to protect him. You don't owe me an apology. I'm the one who owes you." He paused, then added, "I'm not here to take Ethan from you. I'm here to raise him with you, if you'll allow it." Scarlett looked at Gabriel through the blur of tears. And for the first time in 4 years, she saw a different future. A future where she wasn't alone. 3 years later. 3 years had passed since the wedding day in the garden covered in white snow. 3 years filled with laughter, with happiness, with a family that had finally found one another after so many storms. Gabriel was 40 now. A few strands of gray had appeared at his temples, but his eyes were brighter than they'd ever been. He still ran the Ray's empire, but he'd changed the way he worked. He no longer worked 18-hour days. He made time for family, for dinners together, for weekend mornings taking the kids to the park. He'd learned that money and power meant nothing if there was no one to share them with. Scarlett was 30, and she was no longer the silent housekeeper she'd once been. Gabriel had created a charity foundation in Kate's name, dedicated to helping single mothers in difficult circumstances. Scarlett ran it. She'd found a new purpose, helping women like she'd been once. Women fighting alone with no one beside them. Every time Scarlett watched a young mother receive support from the foundation, she remembered the years she raised Ethan by herself, and she knew she was doing the right thing. Ethan was 7, a smart, mischievous boy in 2nd grade at one of the best schools in Chicago. He still had the same black eyes as his father, still had the habit of tilting his head whenever curious about something. And he finally had a dog, a golden-haired retriever Ethan named Captain. Gabriel had kept his promise from the day the boy asked, "Can I have a dog?" right after learning Gabriel was his dad. Captain was now an inseparable member of the family, racing through the mansion and sleeping at the foot of Ethan's bed every night. And Mia, 3 years old, had become the little princess of the Ray's household. She had her mother's curly brown hair, her radiant smile, and the ability to make Gabriel do anything she wanted with a single look. Even though she wasn't his biological child, Gabriel loved Mia no differently than Ethan. He'd put his name on her birth certificate, officially adopted her. In his eyes, Mia was his daughter in every way. Every year on the anniversary of Kate's death, the whole family went together to visit her grave. Gabriel would lay white flowers Kate loved on the headstone, then sit and tell her about their life, about how Ethan was growing, about how Mia had started preschool, about Scarlett and the charity foundation carrying Kate's name. He believed Kate was somewhere out there, smiling down at them. Maybe she'd guided everything toward this moment, bringing Scarlett into his life for a reason he never could have imagined. And every night before sleep, Gabriel would look at Scarlett lying beside him, glance toward Ethan and Mia's rooms, listen to Captain's steady breathing at the end of the hallway, and feel grateful. Grateful for that Friday afternoon when a strange intuition pushed him to follow the pregnant housekeeper. Grateful he hadn't ignored that curiosity, hadn't continued living like a ghost inside an empty mansion. If he hadn't followed Scarlett that day, he would never have known he had a son. He would have kept wasting his life in grief and loneliness, never knowing happiness had been right in front of him, only a bus ride away. The end. This story has ended, but the lessons it leaves behind will last. A lesson about family, that family isn't defined by blood or paperwork, but by love and connection. Gabriel didn't give birth to Mia, but she was still his daughter. Scarlett wasn't the woman Gabriel chose to love from the beginning, but she became the greatest love of his life. A lesson about forgiveness, that sometimes secrets are kept not out of selfishness, but out of love. Scarlett hid Ethan not because she wanted to take Gabriel's son from him, but because she wanted to protect Kate, protect their marriage. And when Gabriel understood that, he chose forgiveness instead of anger. He chose building instead of destroying. A lesson about hope, that it's never too late to begin again. Gabriel thought his life ended when Kate died, but fate gave him a second chance, and he took it. No matter what you're facing, no matter how much you've lost, there is always hope for a brighter tomorrow. What about you? How did this story touch your heart? Have you ever lived through moments when life felt like there was no way out, and then something unexpected changed everything? Share with us in the comments below. We truly love to hear your stories, your feelings from the deepest part of your heart. If this story moved you, please hit the like button to support our channel. Share this video with the people you love, the ones who might need a little hope and faith in life. And if you haven't subscribed yet, subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss the emotional stories we'll bring you every day. Thank you for staying with us until the very last moment of the story. We wish all of you watching good health, a joyful life, and peace each day. Always believe that happiness is waiting for you ahead, sometimes only a decision away, a single step away, or a single afternoon of following someone you never expected.